On the warm evening of August 24th, 1951, a 10-year-old girl disappeared within sight of the street that led straight to her front door. Less than an hour later, as the crowd thinned and the music died away, witnesses would report a child struggling in the back seat of a speeding car, her small voice tearing through the night with a single desperate plea: "I want to get out." What vanished with Beverly Rose Potts that night would leave a city searching for decades, and a family frozen in the last minutes before she was supposed to come home. Late summer settled gently over Cleveland's west side in 1951, the kind of August that carried warmth into the evening and left the air smelling faintly of cut grass, hot pavement, and lake water drifting in from Erie. On Linnet Avenue, the Potts house sat like it always had, modest, sturdy, unremarkable, a place where routines mattered and rules were followed, because that was how the world stayed predictable. Inside, predictability was a kind of safety net, stretched carefully by two parents who believed that if you watched closely enough, nothing truly bad could slip through. Beverly Rose Potts had grown up inside those rules. She was the younger of two daughters, small only by birth date, not by presence. At 10 years old, she stood taller than many girls her age, long-limbed and narrow-shouldered, with a seriousness about her that adults mistook for maturity. At Louis Agassiz Elementary, teachers described her as attentive and well-liked, a steady B student who listened more than she spoke. At home, she moved quietly through rooms, careful not to interrupt, careful not to displease. Her mother called her Rosebud, a name spoken softly, usually accompanied by a hand smoothing hair or adjusting a collar. Music filled her imagination more than conversation. She loved dancing, loved the way movement let her express what words did not. Yet for all that budding grace, she still lined her dolls along the edge of her bed, arranging them with deliberate precision, replaying childhood rituals she was not quite ready to abandon. Growing up, for Beverly, was happening unevenly, her body stretching forward, her inner world clinging to familiar comforts. Her shyness defined her interactions, especially around men. Even men she knew only by association, fathers of friends. Neighbors she passed daily made her retreat inward, shoulders drawn slightly forward, eyes cast down. Her best friend, Patricia, Patsy Swing, noticed it often. Patsy would chatter freely with adults. Beverly hovered at her side, silent, observant, ready to pull away if attention lingered too long. It wasn't fear exactly. It was caution, deeply ingrained. Rules reinforced that caution. Robert and Elizabeth Potts enforced strict curfews, the kind that left no room for negotiation. Beverly knew the consequences of returning late: grounding, disappointment, the heavy silence that settled over the dinner table afterward. Just weeks before August 24th, she had tested that boundary, arriving home a little later than agreed after an outing with her cousin, Amber Lathan. Elizabeth's response was swift and firm. Beverly would not be allowed to attend the upcoming Showagon performance at Halloran Park, the annual children's event everyone in the neighborhood talked about all summer. The punishment cut deep. Performing arts thrilled Beverly. She had spoken about the Showagon for weeks, imagining dancers and singers on the flatbed stage, the music floating through the park as twilight fell. Elizabeth saw the disappointment settle into her daughter's posture, the way Beverly's hands stilled, the way she nodded without protest. And so, like many parental decisions made in good faith, the rule bent. Elizabeth relented, but only under one condition. Beverly would go, watch, and come straight home. No lingering. No excuses. The promise mattered. Beverly took it seriously. By that point, she had already crossed another quiet threshold of childhood. Earlier that summer, she had begged to have her hair cut. For years, she had worn long blonde pigtails that reached nearly to her waist, ribbons tied carefully at the ends. Other girls had begun wearing their hair shorter, bobbed and banged, a fashionable look that signaled something new. Elizabeth resisted at first, reluctant to let go of what the pigtails represented. But in June, she gave in. The scissors snipped, locks fell away, and when it was done, Elizabeth wrapped the severed pigtails in crepe paper and tucked them away. She could not say why she kept them. She only knew she wasn't ready to let them go. On the afternoon of August 24th, nothing felt out of place. Beverly ate supper with her family. the clink of silverware against plates mixing with the hum of a summer evening drifting through open windows. Afterward, she stood at the sink beside her mother, washing dishes carefully, soap bubbles sliding over her fingers. Elizabeth pressed a nickel into her palm for the help. Beverly closed her hand around it, a small, practiced smile crossing her face. The nickel went into her piggy bank later, untouched, where it would remain. By early evening, Beverly and Patsy prepared to leave. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across Linnet Avenue. Beverly dressed deliberately, a reddish-pink turtleneck pulled snug at the neck, blue denim jeans, a navy jacket against the cooling air, brown Kerrybrook shoes laced tightly. She checked herself once more, then wheeled her bicycle out to the sidewalk where Patsy waited. The girls rode off together at about 6:55, tires whispering over concrete, the sound fading quickly as they turned toward Halloran Park. The park lay less than a quarter-mile away, so close that adults rarely worried about it during daylight. But locals knew its reputation. After dark, the large trees swallowed light, their leaves blocking what few street lamps lined the surrounding roads. Vagrants sometimes lingered near the edges. Parents warned their children not to stay late. Beverly had heard those warnings. She understood them. She believed, as children often do, that obedience was protection enough. Halloran Park opened before them just before 7. Already, families gathered near the Showagon stage, a long flatbed truck converted into a makeshift platform. Music tested through speakers, laughter rippled through the crowd, and the smell of popcorn and warm earth mixed in the air. The girls maneuvered their bikes awkwardly through the swelling mass of people, exchanging quick greetings with 2 older girls they recognized, then settling near the performance area. As the evening progressed, the crowd grew thicker, voices overlapping, bodies pressing closer. By 8:10, it became clear that bicycles were more hindrance than help. The girls agreed to ride home, stash their bikes, and return on foot. They did, moving quickly, arriving back at the park before 8:30, slipping once more into the rhythm of the performances. By 8:45, dusk had deepened. Patsy glanced toward the tree line, then back at Beverly. She had promised her parents she would be home before dark. "We should go," she said, the words casual but firm. Beverly shook her head. She was watching the stage, eyes fixed on a group of dancers mid-routine, skirts flaring under the lights. She reminded Patsy of her promise, of the permission she had earned. Patsy hesitated, then turned away, walking home alone. Beverly stayed, and in doing so, she stepped into the last ordinary moments of her life, moments that, at the time, felt no different from any other summer evening. What happened next would change everything. By the time the Showagon reached its final acts, the sky above Halloran Park had darkened to a deep blue, the kind that erased sharp edges and softened faces. The stage lights burned bright against the night, throwing long, shifting shadows across the grass. Beverly stood among the crowd, her jacket pulled closer around her arms as the temperature dipped, her attention fixed on the performers who spun and stepped in time to the music. The air carried competing smells, damp soil underfoot, cigarette smoke drifting from somewhere behind her, the faint metallic tang of machinery humming from the sound equipment. Around her, adults talked over the music. Children laughed and darted between legs, and couples leaned close together. No one was watching one another closely. There was no reason to. This was a neighborhood event, familiar and annual, something Cleveland families trusted. Beverly blended into the mass easily, one small figure among many, her presence unremarkable to anyone who did not know her. The final applause rolled across the park at about 9:30. The performers bowed, the lights dimmed. Conversations swelled as people began to move, the crowd loosening and stretching outward toward the exits. Beverly remained where she was for a moment, taking it all in, reluctant to let the night end. Then, like everyone else, she turned away from the stage and started toward home. She did not rush. The shortest route cut diagonally across the grass, angling toward the corner of Linnet Avenue and West 117. It was a path children used often, worn faintly into the ground. Beverly stepped onto it, her shoes brushing against blades of grass still warm from the day. The park behind her grew louder as people filtered out in clusters, their voices overlapping, footsteps scattering in every direction. Fred Krause pedaled through the park on his bicycle at about the same time, heading home after the show. He lived on Linnet Avenue, too. He knew Beverly from his paper route, had seen her often enough to recognize the way she walked. As he approached, his bicycle light cut a narrow cone through the dimness. He passed a girl walking just off the path, on the grass to the right. Her feet angled outward as she moved, a distinctive, almost playful gait the neighborhood kids joked about. Fred did not stop. He sounded his horn a quick, familiar beep as he rode past. The girl did not respond. She kept walking, steady and alone, headed in the same direction he was. That was the last confirmed moment anyone could place Beverly Potts on her own 2 feet. Beyond the park, West 117 was already quieting down. Only 4 streetlights lined the avenue, each partially swallowed by maple and chestnut trees heavy with summer leaves. The light they cast broke into uneven pools, leaving long stretches of shadow in between. Cars were parked along the curb, their dark shapes barely distinguishable from the night. Several people would later tell police they noticed a car there, a dark, battered Dodge coupe from the late 1930s. Its paint looked roughly applied, its fenders mismatched, the engine idling with a harsh, uneven sound. The muffler rattled loudly, coughing smoke into the air. Some said they saw a young girl standing near it, speaking with 2 young men seated inside. Others remembered the car differently, or placed it at a slightly different time. No one could say they saw her get in. Time in that window became elastic. Some witnesses placed the scene as early as 8:30, others closer to 9:30. The details blurred, but the image lingered. A child near a car that did not belong there, in a stretch of road that should have been familiar and safe. Closer to 10, another report surfaced, this one far more disturbing. An unidentified woman later told investigators she had been near the intersection of West 110 and Baltic Avenue when a dark-colored coupe sped past her, moving north. In the back seat, she saw a child struggling violently, hands pulled behind her, her body twisting against the seat. The window was open. The girl's voice cut through the night, sharp and panicked. "I want to get out," she shouted again and again. The car did not slow. At the time, the woman did not know who the child was. She did not know where the car had come from or where it was going. She only knew what she had seen, and by the time she understood the significance, the vehicle was gone, swallowed by the grid of Cleveland streets. Back on Linnet Avenue, the Potts household waited. 10 o'clock came and went. Elizabeth glanced at the clock, then toward the front window. She told herself Beverly was just a few minutes late, that the crowd had slowed her down. Robert shifted in his chair, listening for the familiar sound of footsteps on the sidewalk, the click of the front gate. None came. Elizabeth reached for the telephone and called the Swing residence. Patsy's mother answered, her voice calm. Patsy had been home for almost an hour, she said. Beverly had stayed behind. The room seemed to contract around that single sentence. Robert stood up immediately. Anita was already reaching for her coat. They stepped outside, the night air cool against their faces, and began walking the route Beverly should have taken past the familiar houses, toward the park, calling her name softly at first, then louder. They scanned doorways, shadows, the edges of yards where children sometimes lingered. Nothing. They reached Halloran Park and crossed it methodically, flashlights cutting weak paths through the dark. The grass was trampled from the evening's crowd, the ground damp beneath their shoes. The stage sat empty now, silent, the energy of the show gone as if it had never been there. They searched until their voices grew hoarse. Back home, Anita began calling the houses of Beverly's friends. When no one answered, she and her parents knocked on doors nearby, hoping someone had seen her, hoping she had stopped in somewhere along the way. Each answer was the same, no. At 10:57, with dread pressing heavily against her chest, Elizabeth contacted the police. When officers arrived shortly after midnight, they moved through the Potts house with routine efficiency. They checked closets, the basement, the attic, places children sometimes hid when upset. Beverly was not there. Her bicycle sat in the garage where she had left it earlier that evening. Her clothes were untouched. Her piggy bank, when checked, still held all her savings, including the nickel she had earned washing dishes. Outside, the street lay quiet under the trees. No sign suggested what had happened in the minutes between the end of the show and the moment Beverly should have turned onto Linnet Avenue. Somewhere in that narrow window of time, something had gone terribly wrong, and as the officers stepped back into the night to begin searching, one question already loomed over everything that followed. Where, exactly, had Beverly Potts gone, and how could she have vanished so completely, so close to home? Midnight passed quietly on Linnet Avenue, but inside the Potts house, time seemed to fracture into sharp, unusable pieces. The officers moved with practiced calm, their shoes creaking softly against the wooden floors as they checked each room again, opening doors that led nowhere new. Elizabeth stood rigid near the kitchen table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Robert hovered near the front window, staring out into the darkness as if willing a small figure to emerge from it. "She wouldn't hide," Elizabeth said finally, her voice thin but steady, as if she needed to convince herself as much as anyone else. "She knows better than that." One of the officers nodded, jotting something down, though he had already reached the same conclusion. Outside, flashlights swept across yards and sidewalks, beams cutting through the shadows cast by trees heavy with leaves. The search widened quickly, officers retracing the path from the Potts home to Halloran Park, then circling back again, moving deliberately, calling out Beverly's name. The night air smelled of damp earth and gasoline, the echoes of their voices falling flat against closed doors and darkened windows. By dawn on August 25th, the scale of the response shifted. What had begun as a neighborhood search hardened into something far larger, far more urgent. Patrol cars lined nearby streets. Detectives arrived, faces drawn, coffee cups clutched in tired hands. Word spread quickly through Cleveland's west side. A child was missing. Detective Chief James MacArthur took charge that morning. He listened carefully as officers relayed what little they had: last sightings, the uncertain timeline, the absence of physical evidence. MacArthur's questions were precise, his tone controlled, but his jaw tightened as the picture came into focus. A 10-year-old girl, alone after dark, gone within minutes of home. "We're not treating this as a runaway," he said firmly, his voice carrying just far enough for the family to hear. Not for a second. 45 officers were assigned full-time to the case almost immediately. Their efforts were reinforced by auxiliary police and civilians who volunteered as soon as they heard. Neighbors knocked on the Potts door offering help, offering prayers, offering casseroles that went untouched on the kitchen counter. The phone rang constantly. Friends, reporters, strangers who had heard a child was missing and wanted to do something. Anything. Search teams fanned out across the area. They went door to door, asking residents if they had seen Beverly, if they had noticed anything unusual the night before, a strange car, raised voices, anything out of place. Officers crawled through vacant lots, peered into alleyways, checked behind garages. Creeks were dragged. Swimming pools were inspected. Sewer openings were lifted, the stench rising sharply as flashlights probed the darkness below. 2 Civil Air Patrol planes took to the sky, scanning rail yards, open freight cars, and stretches of land far beyond the neighborhood. Divers entered Lake Erie, the cold water swallowing them as they searched methodically, their movements slow and precise. Nothing surfaced. No clothing. No trace. Inside the Potts home, Elizabeth replayed the previous evening in her mind with relentless clarity. The dishes, the nickel, Beverly's promise. She moved from room to room restlessly, straightening objects that did not need straightening, touching Beverly's belongings as if to reassure herself they were still real. Robert remained outwardly composed, but when he thought no one was watching, he pressed his hand hard against his mouth, his shoulders sagging under a weight he did not yet know how to carry. Reporters arrived by the end of the day. Cameras and notebooks appeared on the lawn. Elizabeth and Robert agreed to speak, hoping exposure might bring answers. Elizabeth stood close to her husband, her voice trembling only slightly as she spoke. "She wouldn't go with anyone," she said, looking directly into the lens. "She was too shy. She was warned about strangers. She's being held by someone. I know it." The media attention intensified. All 3 of Cleveland's television stations ran Beverly's photograph. Newspapers printed descriptions of her clothing, her height, her hair, the route she should have taken home. A police artist's sketch soon followed, depicting her as she had looked that night. Each broadcast ended with the same plea: "If you have seen this child, call immediately." Tips flooded in. Some were vague, others oddly specific. Detectives chased them all. They tracked down suspicious vehicles, checked alibis, interviewed anyone known to have been in or around Halloran Park that evening. Over the following weeks, dozens of individuals were detained, questioned, then released when nothing linked them to Beverly. Off-duty patrolman George Vorel came forward with what he had observed at the park. He described two young men, late teens or early 20s, openly leering at girls watching the performances, their attention lingering too long. They had slipped behind the stage and disappeared before the show ended. Another girl, Patricia Nag, told police about a young man who had stared at her and made obscene gestures. Neither account led to an identification. The men vanished as cleanly as Beverly had. Investigators expanded their scope. 3 months earlier, a 5-year-old girl had been taken from a department store and later found unharmed. That same spring, underage girls and adult women had been assaulted near Halloran Park and close to the Potts' home. Detectives questioned every known offender on Cleveland's west side, 65 men in total. One by one, they were eliminated. Still, nothing. Inside the Potts household, exhaustion set in. Days blurred together, marked only by the arrival and departure of officers and volunteers. Elizabeth slept in brief snatches, waking abruptly at the smallest sound. Robert spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the telephone as if it might ring with the answer they were waiting for. One evening, as another group of searchers prepared to head out, Robert stepped forward, his voice low but resolute. "Just keep looking," he said. "Please. She's out there somewhere." Rachel. They did keep looking. For days, for weeks, for months. And yet, despite the manpower, the technology of the time, the relentless determination of police and community alike, Beverly Rose Potts remained missing, leaving behind only questions and a family slowly realizing that the search might not end the way they had hoped. As August slid into September, the urgency that had electrified Cleveland began to thin, not because anyone cared less, but because time itself had started to work against them. Leads slowed. The phone rang less often. Search parties that once formed at dawn now gathered in smaller numbers, their movements more methodical, their expectations quieter. The city was still looking for Beverly Potts, but now it was doing so under the heavy realization that she had not simply wandered off and gotten lost. Inside police headquarters, the theory hardened. No ransom note had arrived. Every piece of mail sent to the Potts home was intercepted and screened before reaching Elizabeth's hands. But nothing appeared except sympathy cards and cruel hoaxes. That possibility faded quickly. Investigators focused instead on the scenario they found hardest to accept, yet most consistent with the evidence. Beverly had been taken deliberately, by force or deception, likely for reasons no one wanted to speak aloud. Detective Chief James MacArthur was blunt when pressed by reporters. "She didn't leave on her own," he said, tapping a finger against his notebook as if to punctuate the point. "Everything we know about that child tells us that." His reasoning was grounded in what officers had learned from friends, teachers, neighbors. Beverly was cautious. She avoided unfamiliar adults. She followed rules. If she had gone somewhere willingly, MacArthur believed, it would have been with someone she recognized, someone who felt safe enough in that moment to listen to. The case files grew thick. By the spring of the following year, more than 2,800 entries filled the card system police had built, each card representing a tip, a sighting, a name that had to be checked and eliminated. Over 1,200 of those were potential suspects, some living as far away as Washington State. More than 500 vehicles were traced, their owners questioned, their movements accounted for as best as memory allowed. It was work that required patience bordering on obsession, and for a time, MacArthur and his team gave it exactly that. Then came the suspects, who briefly pulled the investigation back into sharp focus. William Slates was one of the first. 25 years old, unemployed, a former serviceman with a known history of inappropriate behavior toward young girls. He lived close to Halloran Park and had a reputation in the neighborhood that made parents uneasy. When police learned he had abruptly boarded up his home the day after Beverly disappeared and borrowed a friend's car to leave the area, their interest intensified. They searched his house and found a loaded handgun in a bureau drawer. Slates was traced to a hotel in Columbus and brought back for questioning. His story shifted under scrutiny. Friends offered conflicting accounts of where he had been that night. A polygraph suggested deception when he was questioned about Beverly. For a moment, it felt like the pieces might finally be aligning. Then his 17-year-old girlfriend stepped forward with an alibi, claiming they had been together in a car that evening. It was unverifiable, inconsistent with Slate's own statements, but without physical evidence, the case against him collapsed. He walked free, leaving behind a sense of something unfinished that would never be resolved. Other names followed. Frank Dale Davis surfaced months later, not because of evidence, but because he tried to exploit the family's desperation. He called Robert Potts repeatedly, claiming to have Beverly and demanding money. The calls were chilling in their cruelty, the threats explicit. Police orchestrated a sting, sending an undercover officer dressed as Elizabeth to deliver the ransom. Davis was arrested at gunpoint when he appeared to collect it, waving a handkerchief as if acting out a role. After hours of interrogation, he admitted the truth. He had made it all up. He was desperate for cash. Beverly had never been in his possession. He went to prison, but his arrest brought no answers, only another reminder of how vulnerable the Potts family had become. In 1955, Harvey Lee Rush entered the picture from across the country. Arrested in Los Angeles for public intoxication, he confessed to killing a young girl in Cleveland years earlier. He spoke vaguely of a puppet event and claimed to have buried the body beneath a bridge. At first glance, the confession seemed promising, but when detectives examined the details, the story unraveled. Rush described a victim who did not resemble Beverly. Wrong age, wrong hair, wrong time. He could not name her. When extradited back to Cleveland, he recanted entirely, admitting he had fabricated the confession simply to get home. He was released. The case remained where it had been. While investigators chased these leads, Elizabeth Potts's health began to falter. The strain showed in her movements, in the way her voice tired quickly, in the dark circles that settled permanently beneath her eyes. She clung to routine because it was all she had left, cooking meals she could barely eat, keeping Beverly's room exactly as it had been. Each morning, she woke with the same thought, sharp and unavoidable. Today might be the day. 1 week after Beverly disappeared, the family did something that marked a quiet shift in their understanding of what they were facing. They issued a public statement, addressed not to the community, but to whoever had taken their daughter. Robert's hands shook as he read it aloud. "We have finally come to the realization we will never see our Beverly alive again," he said, his voice breaking despite his effort to control it. "We urge whoever did this terrible thing to let us know where she is, so we can give her a proper burial." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. It was not surrender. It was an acknowledgement of reality, as they now understood it. No response ever came. As months turned into years, the investigation slowed. Officers were reassigned. MacArthur remained committed, but even he acknowledged publicly that the chances of finding Beverly alive were gone. Still, he continued to review files, to revisit old tips, to question whether something critical had been missed in those early days. One theory gained traction over time, that Beverly had never left the neighborhood at all, that she had been taken into a nearby house, harmed, and hidden within steps of her own front door. The possibility gnawed at investigators, made worse by the knowledge that house-to-house searches had not been conducted immediately, delayed out of concern for privacy. By the early 1950s, press coverage dwindled. The public moved on. The Potts family could not. Elizabeth died in 1956, her liver failing after years of decline. Friends and relatives whispered what Robert would later say aloud, that she had never truly recovered from the loss of her daughter. Robert lived on alone in the Linnet Avenue house, surrounded by memories, until his own death in 1970. He was found slumped on the couch, the television still on, the silence of the room unbroken. Yet even as the case faded from headlines, it refused to disappear entirely. Tips continued to surface sporadically. Rumors circulated. Years later, detectives would revisit old evidence, new names would emerge, and confessions would be claimed, each promising resolution, each dissolving under scrutiny. The search for Beverly Potts had entered its longest, quietest phase, and though the world had grown accustomed to her absence, the truth, whatever it was, remained buried somewhere, waiting for the moment it would surface again. Time did not heal the disappearance of Beverly Rose Potts. It only changed the way it hurt. By the early 1950s, the case no longer unfolded in bursts of frantic activity but in sudden jolts, moments when hope flared unexpectedly, only to collapse again under the weight of scrutiny. Each new lead arrived like a knock at the door long after midnight, startling, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. The first of those jolts came in September of 1951, barely weeks after Beverly vanished. Along the banks of the Cuyahoga River, behind an industrial warehouse, a worker named Henry Palmer noticed something floating in the current. It was wrapped tightly in cloth, elongated, human-shaped. As it drifted, Palmer caught glimpses of what looked like hands and feet protruding from the fabric. The sight unsettled him enough to call police immediately. Another witness, Ada Scroven, independently reported seeing the same object. She was adamant about one detail: the bundle, she insisted, had been bound with rope. Police dragged the riverbed repeatedly. Hooks scraped along submerged debris. Divers entered the murky water, their visibility limited to inches, their movements slow and careful. The smell of oil and decay hung over the riverbank. Nothing was recovered. No bundle, no remains. The river kept its secret, and with it, another fragile piece of hope slipped away. Years passed. By 1954, the Potts case had become part of Cleveland's collective memory, invoked whenever a child went missing or a disturbing rumor surfaced. That year, police arrested a small group involved in distributing illegal photographs. Among the seized material was an image of a young girl, prepubescent, frightened-looking, who bore a resemblance to Beverly. When investigators showed the image to Robert and Elizabeth Potts, they studied it in silence, their faces tightening as they searched for certainty. At first, they believed it might be her. Then, slowly, painfully, they concluded it was not. The girl in the photograph remained unidentified. Beverly remained missing. By the 1970s, most of the original investigators had retired or passed on. Files yellowed. Records were misplaced or lost. But the case refused to rest completely. In early 1973, police received an anonymous tip from a woman in Chardon who claimed she had known Beverly as a child. She said Beverly's body was buried in the grease pit of a former auto repair shop on West 52nd Street. The pit was opened in April. The air inside was stale and acrid, decades of oil and residue clinging to the concrete walls. Officers searched carefully, methodically. The pit was empty. Another door closed. In 1980, two retired Cleveland detectives, James Forrest and Robert Shankland, spoke publicly about something they had carried quietly for years. Back in 1974, they said, a local attorney had approached them with a troubling claim. His client believed his own brother had abducted and killed Beverly Potts. The brother, when questioned, admitted to living near Halloran Park in 1951. He admitted to prowling the area, to picking up young girls, to harming them. He spoke vaguely of memories, flashes involving a girl named Beverly, but claimed he could not remember the specific crime. Shankland later said the man revealed details only someone involved would know. Records showed the vehicle he owned at the time matched descriptions given by witnesses near the park. Forrest and Shankland believed they had their man. Prosecutors did not. There was no body, no physical evidence, no case strong enough to survive a courtroom. The man walked free. Much of the documentation related to him would later disappear entirely, likely removed during investigations into other child crimes and never returned. The truth, once again, slipped through institutional fingers. In February of 1994, the past resurfaced in the most unexpected of places. A couple renovating a house on Midvale Avenue pulled up old carpeting on a staircase and found a bundle of yellowed notebook paper tucked beneath it, alongside a man's shirt. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible. The author identified herself as Anna Haynick. Her handwritten account was detailed, graphic, and explosive. She claimed her husband, Steve Haynick, had abducted and killed Beverly Potts. She accused him of unspeakable acts, claimed Beverly had died accidentally, and alleged she had witnessed him destroy the child's remains in the basement furnace. She even suggested Beverly might have been his biological child, the result of a prior assault. Police tracked Anna Haynick down. By then, she was 83 years old. She admitted writing the notes, but insisted they were fiction. A revenge fantasy, she said, written decades earlier during a period of abuse and rage. She told investigators she had hidden the pages and forgotten them entirely. Her husband had died in 1981. There was no corroborating evidence. The allegations went nowhere. By the turn of the millennium, the Potts case had become a magnet for confessions. Beginning in July of 2000, a series of handwritten letters arrived at the offices of the Cleveland plain dealer. The writer claimed to be an elderly man, terminally ill, ready to confess before death. He described luring Beverly into his car, harming her when she resisted, then disposing of her body in the Cuyahoga River. The details were chilling. The tone was remorseful. The timing approaching the 50th anniversary felt deliberate. Investigators studied the letters closely. Too closely. Phrases appeared lifted from earlier case files. Claims echoed known rumors and disproven theories. Successive letters contradicted one another. Police began to suspect the writer had access to investigative materials, possibly even law enforcement experience. When the author promised to turn himself in on the anniversary of Beverly's disappearance, detectives prepared. Days before the date, another letter arrived. He claimed illness had forced him into a nursing home. He could not reveal himself after all. No one ever did. More letters arrived in 2002. They, too, collapsed under examination. And still, the case refused to die. One suspect continued to hover at the edges of possibility. William Henry Redmond, a former carnival worker with a history stretching back decades. Redmond had been convicted of crimes involving young girls since the 1930s. In 1988, he was indicted for the murder of an 8-year-old girl in Pennsylvania, whose body had been found inside his carnival vehicle. When questioned about Beverly Potts, Redmond was terminally ill. Prosecutors offered immunity in exchange for the truth. He said nothing. Redmond died in 1992, taking whatever he knew with him. By then, nearly every avenue had been explored and re-explored. Leads chased, files reopened, promises made and broken by time. Each supposed breakthrough followed the same cruel pattern. Anticipation, investigation, collapse. What remained was not a single revelation, but a devastating realization. Beverly Rose Potts had not disappeared because no one looked hard enough. She had disappeared despite everything, despite manpower, publicity, determination, and decades of refusal to let her be forgotten. And as the case moved deeper into history, one question refused to fade with it. How many times had the truth come close, only to slip away unnoticed? By the time the Beverly Potts case entered its 5th decade, it no longer belonged solely to the police. It lived instead in memories, in scraps of paper, in the habits of people who had learned, sometimes painfully, that safety could vanish in the space between a park and a front door. There would be no courtroom, no verdict read aloud, no moment when handcuffs closed around a wrist and the story finally stopped moving. What remained was something quieter, heavier, and harder to resolve. In Cleveland, parents who had once watched the search parties comb Halloran Park never forgot the lesson. Children who grew up in the 1950s remembered how suddenly the rules changed, how freedom narrowed, how dusk became a deadline instead of an atmosphere. Halloran Park was still there, still green in summer, but it was no longer just a park. It was a reminder. For the Potts family, the aftermath unfolded not in headlines but in slow erosion. Elizabeth Potts never returned to the woman she had been before August 24, 1951. The years that followed drained her physically and emotionally, each unanswered question pressing into her health. Friends noticed how she tired easily, how her eyes seemed permanently fixed on something just beyond reach. When she died in May of 1956, only 56 years old, Robert would later tell reporters that her decline had begun the night Beverly failed to come home. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, spoken plainly, without drama. Robert stayed in the Linnet Avenue house for years after Elizabeth's death. He lived among objects that carried memory, whether he wanted them to or not. The furniture Beverly had passed each day, the rooms where her footsteps should have echoed. He spoke of her rarely, but neighbors noticed he never stopped listening. When he died in February of 1970, alone in the living room with the television still on, it felt to those who knew him like the final quiet chapter of a story that had never offered him answers. Anita Potts carried the weight differently. She moved away in 1952, built a life elsewhere, married, had children of her own. But Beverly followed her into every decision she made as a parent. Anita became vigilant, strict, always needing to know where her children were and who they were with. She spoke of her sister sparingly, not because she had forgotten, but because the cost of speaking was too high. Her daughter would later say it was simply too painful that Beverly existed in their family as a presence, rather than a story. In 1991, 4 decades after the disappearance, Anita did something she had postponed for years. She arranged for a memorial stone to be placed beside her parents' graves in West Park Cemetery. The marker bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Beverly Rose Potts." At the unveiling, Anita stood quietly, her hands folded, and told those present that if her sister's remains were ever found, this was where she should rest with the family that never stopped waiting. Anita continued to follow developments in the case until her death in 2006. She never stopped hoping, though hope had long since changed its shape. It was no longer about rescue or reunion. It was about truth, about knowing. The police never formally closed the case. Tips continued to arrive, fewer with each passing year, but still taken seriously, still logged, still checked. The Crime Stoppers reward remained active. Somewhere in the files, Beverly's name stayed where it had always been, unresolved. There was no single villain to remember, no confirmed face to attach to the crime. Instead, the case became a composite of possibilities. A car idling too long on a dark street, a voice calling out from a back seat, a bundle drifting briefly into view before vanishing beneath the surface. It was a story defined by absence of evidence, of certainty, of an ending. And yet, Beverly herself never disappeared entirely. She remained 10 years old in every photograph, her expression caught between childhood and something more serious, her hair neatly styled, her gaze steady. She remained the girl who loved dancing, who earned a nickel for washing dishes, who promised her mother she would come straight home. She remained the child who followed the rules. In the end, the tragedy of Beverly Rose Potts is not only that she vanished, it is that she vanished in plain sight, in a place filled with people, within minutes of safety. It is that every reasonable effort was made, and still, the truth slipped away. It is that a family did everything right and lost her anyway. The story begins where it ends, with a short walk home that never finished. On a summer night in 1951, a girl left a park and stepped into darkness. She was supposed to be home in minutes. Instead, she became a question that time has never answered. And until that answer comes, Beverly Rose Potts remains exactly where she has always been, on the edge of home, waiting to be found. More than 70 years have passed, yet the questions remain unfinished. Who noticed something and didn't realize it mattered? What moment, what choice, what missed second allowed a 10-year-old girl to disappear within minutes of home? If you have a theory, a doubt, or even a detail that feels small but won't let go, share it. Because cases like Beverly Rose Potts don't stay alive through files and records alone. They stay alive because people keep asking the question that was never answered. What do you think happened to Beverly? Subscribe to the channel for long-form true crime narratives told with care, precision, and respect for the people at the center of these cases. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story waiting to be told. Because some victims only remain alive in memory as long as someone is willing to listen.